Hey guys, Henry here. Today we're making Alvin Zhou's 100-hour tiramisu. The amounts of each ingredient in this recipe are very specific, so I'll just name the ingredients and put the actual amounts in the description. For this recipe, we'll need heavy cream, lemons, eggs, sugar, flour, powdered sugar, unsalted butter, Marsala wine, salt, espresso, water, 70% dark chocolate, this is actually some leftover chocolate from the 150-hour cake, and cocoa powder. Day 1 of this recipe is going to be dedicated to making the mascarpone cheese. To do this, I'm going to add 1.5 quarts of my heavy cream to a pot and bring it up to 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I'm going to take it off heat, add the juice of a whole lemon, and stir it up. The heavy cream curdled, which I was super disappointed about because I didn't have much more, but then the tiramisu gods smiled upon me and it just uncurdled for some reason. I don't really know how that happened, but hey, I'm not going to complain. The next step would be to pour it into cheesecloth instead of mesh sieve inside a bowl, but as it turned out, I didn't have cheesecloth. So my dad just drove over to the store and got some, so huge thank you to him. He helped out a lot with this recipe. I poured it into the cheesecloth, covered it in saran wrap, and brought it up to the fridge. The next step is to make our Ladyfinger cakes. So I separated 6 egg yolks and 6 egg whites, being very careful to avoid any yolks in my whites. The reason for this is that yolks have a lot of fat, so even a small amount of yolk in egg whites can prevent them from working properly. I then added half a cup of sugar to my whites and whipped them until they formed light, fluffy, stiff peaks. Next I added a cup of sugar to my yolks, which I immediately realized was way too much. The yolks ended up being pretty grainy and a much lighter color than they were supposed to be, so if you make this, then I recommend you only use half a cup. Next I mixed the yolks and whites together to form this beautiful light batter. I then mixed in 1 cup of flour. Before we bake this, if you plan on making this recipe, make a double batch of cake, because when it came time to assemble the cake, I only had 1 layer, so I had to cut it in half. I spread it onto a 9x13 baking pan and baked it for 15 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I should mention that I got the bake time and temperature from a comment made by a user named Sarah Patisol, so thank you to them. When the cake came out of the oven, I immediately realized that I'd forgotten to sprinkle powdered sugar over the batter, so it didn't have the crust it was supposed to. By now, it was 11 p.m., so I wrapped it up and decided to continue in the morning. The next day, Sunday, I needed to make the rest of the components and assemble the tiramisu. I started by making my Marsala caramel. I added 1.5 cups of sugar to a pot and started stirring it. By the time it had fully caramelized, it didn't have the same consistency as Alvin, so I decided to cook it just a little bit longer. As it turns out, this was a horrendous mistake, because within seconds the caramel burned. Before I realized it had burned, I tried to smell it to get an idea of how it was doing. Instead of a sweet, rich smell, I got a nose full of smoke, which burned like crazy. I scrapped that batch and started again. Once more, I added 1.5 cups of sugar and caramelized it. It was looking a little better, so I added a 1/3 cup of my Marsala and stirred it up. Once it had reached what I deemed to be the proper color, I took it off heat and added 5 tablespoons of butter and a 1/3 cup of heavy cream. By the time it was fully combined, I realized it was much thinner than it was supposed to be, so I put it back on heat. I stirred it for about 30 minutes, which is way too long. For the people that don't know, caramel is only supposed to cook for about 5 minutes. I had forgotten to do my research, so I was one such person. I took it off the heat and left it to cool. I didn't get footage of this, but when I came back a few hours later, the caramel was fully hardened, making it almost impossible to get out of the pot. On attempt number 3, I finally caved and looked up a recipe. I found one by Goody Godmother, which was very helpful. The link to their website is in the description. I added 1.5 cups of sugar, caramelized it until it had just fully dissolved, and added a 1/3 cup of my Marsala. I then lightly swirled it until it became, quote, a medium copper color. I took it off heat, added 3 tablespoons of butter and half a cup of heavy cream, and set it aside, having successfully made caramel sauce. Later, I also sprinkled it with a bit of salt. One thing though, if you plan to make this, make sure to add a little bit of lemon juice, as this prevents any kind of crystallization. Next up is an espresso soak. This is very simple. I just added roughly a 1/3 cup of espresso, Marsala, and water, as well as about 1.5 teaspoons of sugar to a bowl. This ended up being the wrong ratio, so if you want to make this, I recommend making it with a 1/3 cup of espresso, 3 tablespoons of water, and 2 tablespoons of Marsala. The final thing we need to make is a mascarpone filling. I removed my mascarpone cheese from the fridge and took off the saran wrap. I was very happy to see that it had properly thickened. Separated 8 egg yolks, which took a really long time, since clearly separating yolks is not my forte. To those yolks, I added half a cup of sugar, a pinch of salt, and my mascarpone cheese, and mixed it using an electric mixer. To a different bowl, I added a 1/3 cup of heavy cream and 2 tablespoons of sugar. Of course, it was only after they had fully whipped that I realized this wasn't enough, so I tried to add more heavy cream, which kind of deflated the already whipped cream. If you want to make this, use 2/3 of a cup of heavy cream and 3 tablespoons of sugar instead. I folded together my heavy cream and my mascarpone mix. It was a little runny because of the heavy cream, but it was still very good. Finally, it was time to assemble the cake. I didn't have the foresight to make 2 cake layers, so I had to cut the cake into 2 separate, smaller tiramisus. I poured in some of my espresso soak, added a cake layer, brushed it with the soak, drizzled it with caramel sauce, dusted it with cocoa powder, poured on my mascarpone filling, brushed another layer with my espresso soak on both sides, layered it in, drizzled it with more caramel sauce, dusted it with more cocoa powder, shaved on more chocolate, poured on more mascarpone filling, and finally sprinkled it with more cocoa powder. I'm just gonna stop talking for a second so you can see this other tiramisu being assembled. tiramisu was now fully assembled, so I brought it up to the fridge. That's gonna rest for the next 3 days, so while we wait, let's talk about this tiramisu. Alvin's tiramisu is sort of a modification of traditional tiramisu. Whereas tiramisu usually has ladyfingers soaked in coffee, layered with mascarpone cheese, and topped with cocoa powder, Alvin's also contains a Marsala caramel and chocolate shavings, as well as having a little bit of wine in the coffee soak. Alvin's video doesn't have a recipe, but based solely on the visuals and a few comments, I was able to piece together the ingredients and amounts. According to Rivereno.com, there are 2 possible theories for the origin of tiramisu. I apologize in advance for my horrendous butchering of names. One theory is that it originated in the city of Treviso, Italy in the 1960s. It was created in a restaurant called Le Beccarie, and the idea was based off of the traditional Venetian dessert, sbatudine. The other theory is that it originated a little further back in the 1950s in a hotel in Udine, Italy. The Ministry of Agriculture and Food Resources considers this to be the authentic story. Anyway, let's get back to baking. On Wednesday, I brought it out from the fridge. I carefully removed the saran wrap, and I was happy to see that the tiramisu had fully retained its structure. It's not the prettiest tiramisu, but the important part is how it tastes. I cut up a piece and plated it. My sister, who was also in my last video about an Alvin Zhou dessert, wanted me to credit her, so thank you to my sister Keely for helping me to eat the tiramisu. I tasted it, and it was incredible. The overall texture was extremely soft, the cake was very moist, there was a nice balance between the darker flavors of the coffee and cocoa powder and the lighter flavors of the cake and mascarpone. Unlike the chocolate cake, I got a good amount of the Marsala taste, and the caramel added a very nice touch. However, like any dessert, there were a few problems with it. I wish the mascarpone filling had a little bit more sweetness, as I think it was a little bland in the end. I also wish it was a bit lighter and more voluminous to boost the visual appeal. I wish I got more of the coffee flavor in the soak. I wish I hadn't forgotten the powdered sugar on the cake layer, and I wish that I had remembered to add an acid to the caramel to prevent it from crystallizing. Overall though, for a recipe that I figured out in a half hour based on a single video while bored on vacation, having never made tiramisu before, I think this turned out really well. Would I recommend you make this? If you have a lot of free time and a little extra saved, then absolutely. It's completely delicious, and despite looking incredibly difficult, it's really very simple. As long as you have a recipe, it'll turn out fine. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. It means a lot and helps me do these kinds of projects in the future. Comment down below what you think I should make next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Happy holidays!